The golden chandeliers above the Worthington estate ballroom glistened like a shrine to old money. Everything down to the polished silverware and imported white roses was curated to perfection. It was supposed to be Julia Worthington's wedding day, a spectacle of elegance, power, and generational wealth. Except, she wasn't there to get married. The guests didn't know that yet. Neither did the groom, Thomas Carrington IV, whose family merged oil with legacy, and whose smile masked a soul carved from ambition and cruelty. Julia stood behind the heavy velvet curtain of the gallery above, unseen, watching them all. Her father, Richard Worthington, beaming with pride at the alliance he had forged. Her stepmother, Celeste, sipping champagne like the queen of a kingdom built on betrayal, and her younger half-brother, Michael, smirking as if he already knew the seat at the empire's head table would one day be his. It had taken Julia 5 years, 3 aliases, and 1 forged disappearance to come back into that room without anyone recognizing the woman they once erased. And now, with everything in place, she was ready to tear the Worthington dynasty apart, starting with the day that was supposed to make her one of them forever. She had once been the chosen daughter, groomed for legacy, raised on etiquette, strategy, and quiet submission. But when Julia was 22 and dared to speak out against her father's cover-up of a major employee injury scandal at Worthington Industrial, she wasn't just ignored, she was eliminated. Richard had used a private clause in the family trust, one that no one outside the bloodline knew about, to dissolve her stake. Mental instability, the documents said, unsuitable for succession, and just like that, she was gone. Institutionalized briefly under false pretenses, then exiled from the company's assets, public photos scrubbed, trust funds frozen. Even Celeste, who once called her darling girl, stood silently by, watching it unfold like a scene in a play she'd already seen. Julia had fled, changed her name, vanished from New York. She lived in Chicago for a year under a new identity, waiting tables while she mapped out every piece of the empire that once belonged to her. She wasn't born vengeful, but betrayal has a way of reshaping the soul, and she learned fast: patience, silence, strategy. Now she was back, not as a daughter, but as a storm. The return began with a forged invitation to the wedding, slipped onto the guest list under the name Julianne Carter, an obscure art investor from Berlin. No one questioned her presence. The Worthingtons had so many high-profile allies, distant cousins, and whispered partnerships. No one noticed the quiet, elegant woman with a silk scarf and piercing eyes sitting alone at table 6. She wore sunglasses. Indoors, not for vanity, but for armor hiding the woman they once discarded. She watched the guests laugh and drink, toasting the bride who had yet to walk down the grand staircase. Waiters moved like dancers, orchestras played string quartets, and the scent of wealth was almost overwhelming. Every piece of it, every smile, every false cheer only fueled her more. Because this wedding wasn't going to end with vows. It was going to end with revelation. She waited until the officiant began pacing, until the tension in the crowd grew thick, until whispers filled the room. "Where's the bride?" Then, just as the first ripple of panic reached the groom's face, Julia descended the staircase alone, unveiled and uninvited. Every head turned. Gasps filled the room like a rising tide. Her father rose to his feet, face pale. Celeste clutched Michael's arm. The groom's mouth opened, but no words came. Julia walked slowly, deliberately, her heels clicking like a ticking clock. She stepped onto the platform where the ceremony was to take place, took the microphone meant for vows, and looked directly into the camera broadcasting the event live. To the Carrington investors and international press. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, voice steady, "I'm Julia Worthington. You may remember me as the daughter they tried to erase. Today was meant to be my wedding day." Not to him. She nodded at Thomas, but to justice. "And it has finally arrived." Gasps echoed like gunshots in the Worthington ballroom as Julia stood at the altar, unflinching beneath 1,000 horrified stares. "Before this room watches another generation of power marry into corruption," she said, her voice steady. And echoing through the speakers, "You deserve to know who you're toasting." Behind her, the giant wedding screen flickered and then changed. Gone was the floral monogram of W&C. In its place, a slideshow of documents, photos, and contracts. The first image, a settlement agreement from 2014. Julia tapped the screen remote in her hand. This, she said, is a non-disclosure agreement signed by a 19-year-old warehouse employee paralyzed by a forklift accident due to faulty maintenance at Worthington Industrial. She tapped again. And this is my father's signature. Paying her off with hush money instead of fixing the facility. A hush fell across the room. Guests looked at Richard Worthington, whose jaw clenched tighter than steel. Julia didn't pause. She'd prepared for this moment for 5 years, rehearsed it like a performance. And she wasn't done. Next slide. An offshore banking statement. This account was created 2 months after my mother's death, Julia continued. It funneled over $6 million from family accounts to a shell company in Panama co-signed by Celeste Worthington. Gasps again. Celeste's expression barely shifted, but her knuckles turned white on the armrest. She wasn't grieving. She was securing control. Julia's eyes met hers. And you told me I was too emotional to inherit. That grief made me unstable. You were wrong. My grief made me dangerous. Michael stood now, trying to move toward the platform. Julia raised her hand calmly. Don't, she said, unless you want the IRS to open that briefcase you left in your prep school locker. Yes, people talk, Michael. Especially former girlfriends you thought were beneath you. His face flushed red. You don't know what you're doing, he snapped. Julia turned to the crowd. He's right. I know exactly what I'm doing. The screen faded to black. The room stood still, like glass on the edge of a table, shocked, paralyzed, breathless. Julia turned off the mic and stepped down. No guards came for her. No one dared. She walked calmly through the stunned crowd, past open mouths and half-raised champagne flutes, and out the front doors of the Worthington estate, leaving behind her own past. Like smoke from a match just struck, the world would catch fire in the morning. She'd made sure of that. Outside, a car waited, black, unmarked, engine humming softly. She slipped into the back seat. Did they air it? She asked the driver. He nodded. Broadcast to the full Carrington investment stream, +3. Press wires. And the blog you wanted posted the documents at PM. Julia let out a breath, not relief, just confirmation. Good, she said. Phase 1 is complete. Her voice was ice wrapped in silk. That night, social media exploded. #Worthington cover-up trended worldwide. Screenshots of the documents circulated, followed by side-by-side images of Julia, before erasure and the wedding return. Morning shows ran headlines like Heiress hijacks family wedding to expose empire and Julia Worthington isn't gone, she's glorious. Public sentiment shifted rapidly. What had once been whispers about the unstable Worthington girl turned into admiration, fury, and momentum. The damage control machine kicked in, but it was too late. The story had outpaced the spin. Julia had won the first battle, exposure, but her war wasn't over. She wasn't just there to humiliate them. She was there to reclaim what was hers. The bloodline contract, an internal clause buried in the Worthington family trust, stated that in the absence of a suitable heir, the eldest biological descendant would retain voting power, pending public reinstatement. They had tried to remove her by declaring her mentally unfit. But no, the world had seen her calm, composed, calculating. The clause was active, and she intended to use it. The Worthington boardroom had never felt so cold. 12 men and women, gray-haired, legacy-bound, burdened by their own fortunes, sat around the obsidian table, papers in hand, avoiding each other's eyes. At the head of the table, a chair remained conspicuously empty. It had belonged to Richard Worthington for decades. But this morning, that chair pulled back, and in walked Julia Worthington, not in a gown, not as a guest, but as the legally reinstated controlling heir of the Worthington estate. The contract was airtight. Julia had filed it with the family's internal review court just hours after her public reveal. And with the media storm backing her and the clause activated by her reappearance and mental fitness evaluation, the board had no choice. She was back, not as a visitor, as a power. Let's begin, she said, sliding a folder toward each board member. Inside, a restructure plan, forensic audits, and a list of all current subsidiaries under legal risk due to her father's, Celeste's and Michael's activities. There will be no more hush money, no more private accounts, no more pretending. This family isn't stained from top to bottom. One board member, a man named Hal who had voted against her return, cleared his throat. Julia, I respect your passion, but this isn't how we operate. She looked up slowly. You mean with secrets and a vote behind closed doors? Her tone was smooth, but edged. No, that's exactly how we got here. Celeste issued a press statement that afternoon. She called Julia's reinstatement a tragic mistake, labeled her a media manipulator, and threatened legal countersuits for defamation. But even her PR spin couldn't withstand the rising tide of public fury. Former employees of Worthington subsidiaries started to speak out. A janitor from a West Texas plant shared how he'd been fired for refusing to falsify a safety report. A woman from HR revealed pay discrepancies and internal harassment claims buried by Celeste's private legal team. Julia riposted every story, quietly, powerfully. She knew she didn't need to say much. She had opened the floodgates, and the truth was pouring in. Meanwhile, Richard Worthington vanished from the public eye. Rumors circled that he had retreated to the family's secluded lake house in Montana. Julia didn't care. She wasn't hunting ghosts. She was rebuilding an empire in her name and rewriting the foundation. First, she froze all corporate donations linked to political lobbying. Then, she dissolved 3 shadow corporations designed to funnel money into private Caribbean accounts. Each move was calculated, legal, loud, and each time she made a change, she released a statement signed not Julia Worthington, daughter, but Julia Worthington, principal chair. Michael, desperate to retain control, leaked confidential emails in an attempt to frame Julia for insider trading. But the documents were doctored and she had the originals. Within 24 hours, her legal team issued a cease and desist, followed by a lawsuit of her own. Michael tried to leave the country. He was stopped at JFK. The federal authorities had opened a case. He was no longer a player. He was a liability. A T night, Julia returned to the townhouse she had reclaimed in Manhattan, once her mother's. Before she died of an accidental overdose, a death Julia no longer believed was accidental at all. In her mother's old study, Julia lit a candle, pulled out the leather-bound journal she kept in secret, and wrote, "They always told me I was too emotional to lead. But what they didn't know was that emotion, when mastered, becomes the sharpest weapon." She was just halfway through her plan. The board was shaken. The public was watching, and for the first time in Worthington history, accountability was no longer optional. Julia had always known her father kept secrets, but nothing had prepared her for what she found buried in the hidden vault beneath the Worthington Library, an unregistered basement level accessible only through a biometric scanner embedded in the fireplace mantel. She discovered the entrance by accident or fate when her mother's old journal, discovered in a locked drawer, mentioned the ledger beneath the ash. What she uncovered wasn't just incriminating. It was monstrous. Inside the vault were over 40 years of blackmail files, covert surveillance logs, and a set of hand-bound books titled GL, each filled with names, payment logs, and pressure points, documents that detailed a sprawling web of control. Her father had built an empire not just with wealth, but with fear. Judges, senators, contractors, medical boards, each name neatly listed, with corresponding threats or bribes. It was the real reason the Worthingtons had stayed untouchable for generations. Julia stood in that dark room, the air stale with mold and old paper, and realized she hadn't just inherited a company. She had inherited a machine. One folder was labeled with her mother's name, Caroline Worthington. Inside were psychological reports, therapy transcripts, and medication invoices. Caroline had suffered in silence for years, dismissed by Richard as unstable, much like Julia had been. But the file told a different story, one of gaslighting, over-medication, and isolation. The accidental overdose that ended her life had been preceded by months of forced prescriptions signed off by private doctors on Richard's payroll. Julia's hands trembled as she read her mother's final plea, written in a therapist's notes. "He's trying to erase me." The grief that surged through Julia wasn't loud. It was silent, cold, and infinite. Her mother hadn't died. She'd been erased, just like Julia had almost been. Only now, the erasure would be undone. The next day, Julia took the entire ghost ledger and submitted a digital copy to a federal task force on corruption. Anonymously, she didn't want the credit. She wanted the system to fall apart from the inside, using the tools her father once used to protect it. The Worthington machine was going to consume itself, but she kept one file out, her mother's. That was personal. That needed a different kind of justice. Julia held a press conference that week, not in the glitzy Worthington offices, but in front of the Women's Crisis Justice Center in Manhattan. There, she told her mother's story, not as scandal, but as truth, how Caroline Worthington had been manipulated, silenced, and turned into a public tragedy for the sake of image. The crowd that gathered wept, not just for Caroline, but for every woman who had been told her pain was hysteria. My mother didn't lose her mind, Julia said softly into the mic. She lost her freedom, and I'm here to make sure no daughter ever has to lose her mother to silence again. The crowd rose in applause, not the flashy kind, but the heavy kind, the kind that echoes in your bones. Inside the Worthington boardroom, chaos erupted. Celeste accused Julia of treason against her own name. One board member resigned. Two others turned over their shares to Julia's trust, unable to stomach what they now knew. Richard, still in hiding, issued a statement from his lawyer denying all involvement. But Julia knew his time was coming. The evidence was irrefutable, and for once, the world had stopped turning away. Later that night, Julia returned to the townhouse and stood at her mother's old vanity. She placed the final photo she had left of Caroline smiling beside a younger Julia into a frame made of simple oak and glass. No gold, no insignia, just memory. Then she lit a candle and whispered, "You weren't crazy. You were right." And as the flame flickered in the mirror, she saw her reflection, not as a daughter of wealth or an heiress of scandal, but as a woman who had survived the very house meant to consume her. She was almost finished. Richard Worthington had always believed he was untouchable. Even as scandals swirled and allies fell, he remained tucked away in the Montana Lake House, a fortress of stone and privilege nestled among pines, guarded not by armed men but by arrogance. He believed his name alone would shield him. But when Julia's car pulled into the long gravel drive, her presence shattered the illusion like frost under sunlight. He opened the door himself, dressed in a thick wool sweater, his once pristine hair now streaked with gray. "I wondered when you'd come," he said, his voice brittle with age and disdain. "I didn't come for closure," Julia replied, stepping inside. "I came for accountability." The lake house smelled of smoke and scotch. The living room hadn't changed since her childhood, same stone fireplace, same dusty oil paintings of dead Worthington men who stared down at her like ghosts still guarding a kingdom. Julia sat in the same chair her mother once favored, across from the man who destroyed them both. She placed a slim folder on the table between them. "You know what this is," she said. He looked down at it but didn't touch it. "It's over, Julia," he said. "You think you've won, but you haven't changed a thing. The world still runs on men like me." Her gaze didn't falter. "No, the world used to run on men like you. It's starting to run on people like me now." Richard leaned back, the smirk fading. "You don't understand the cost of power," he muttered. Julia's voice was calm, almost soft. "No, you don't understand the cost of losing it." She slid a second envelope toward him, her mother's death file, annotated with the truth. "You didn't just erase her. You killed her slowly, deliberately, with pills and silence. And then you tried to do the same to me." Richard didn't deny it. He only looked at the flames in the hearth, as if trying to burn the past with his stare alone. "She was unstable," he muttered. "She couldn't handle the life." Julia's hand clenched around the armrest. "She was handling your cruelty, and I inherited every ounce of her strength, not her weakness." There was a long silence, heavy and suffocating. Then Julia stood. "The federal prosecutors will be here in 48 hours. They'll knock on this door, and you'll have two choices: walk out with dignity, or be dragged out in cuffs." Richard didn't respond. His silence was the last defense of a man watching the world he built collapse. Julia stepped to the window and looked out at the frozen lake. "This place is yours," she said. "I won't take it, but I will tell the truth about what happened here." She turned back, her voice colder than the snow outside. "You are the end of the Worthington name. I am what comes next." That night, as her car pulled away, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt still. There was no victory in confronting a man already drowning in the legacy of his own rot. But there was justice. Quiet, final, irreversible justice. And it felt like breath after years of suffocation. The next morning, federal agents arrived at the Montana property. Cameras caught Richard being led into a car in silence. No cuffs yet, but the trial was inevitable. His lawyer released a statement of full cooperation. The headlines ran with it, but Julia didn't watch. She was in New York, meeting with a group of new trustees, finalizing her plan to dissolve the family conglomerate into a multi-foundation network for public interest work. The Worthington Company would die with Richard's indictment. What would? rise in its place? Something built from truth.as. She signed the final transfer documents. Her hand didn't tremble. She looked at the notary, nodded, and said, "History starts here." 6 months after her father's arrest, Julia Worthington stood at the top floor of the old Worthington Tower, now renamed the Caroline Foundation, in honor of the woman the world had nearly forgotten. The brass plaque outside the building no longer bore the family crest. In its place was a single line, engraved with steel precision: "Truth builds what power destroys." The company had been dismantled, every asset reallocated, every toxic partnership severed. It was no longer a family empire, it was a public service engine, run by a new board made up of survivors, whistleblowers, and ethics experts. Julia wasn't CEO. She didn't need to be. She was chair emeritus by choice, content to guide quietly from the side, no longer clinging to power like the Worthingtons before her. Her legacy wasn't about holding a throne. It was about burning the throne to the ground and planting something better in its ashes. The world had changed its view of her. Gone were the headlines calling her unstable, dramatic, or dangerous. Now she was the architect of one of the greatest corporate reckonings in American history. But even the praise didn't move her much. What mattered were the letters. She received hundreds each week from young women, from former employees of corrupt firms, from daughters who had once been silenced like she was. "Because of you, I reported my boss. Because of you, I kept fighting. Because of you, I believe healing is possible." These were her true inheritance, not trust funds or board votes, but proof that one voice, once erased, could still echo loud. Enough to shift an entire system. Celeste vanished from public life, retreating to a villa in southern France, her remaining influence withering by the day. Michael took a plea deal: financial forfeiture, community service, and permanent ban from holding any executive position again. Richard, he was awaiting trial, under house arrest, his kingdom of silence now shattered and his name synonymous with downfall. Julia didn't visit him. She didn't send letters. There was nothing left to say. She had rewritten the end of their story, and that was enough. But the final chapter she needed to finish wasn't for the world. It was for her mother. On a bright October morning, Julia returned to the family cemetery plot in Connecticut. Alone. No cameras, no press, just her and a small brass urn filled with lavender sprigs. She knelt before Caroline Worthington's headstone, brushing away the leaves, and placed a new inscription beneath the original one. It read, "She told the truth." Before anyone listened, Julia sat there in the grass for hours, not crying, not angry, just present. She whispered stories of her journey, the revenge, the redemption, the moment she felt her mother standing behind her in the ballroom, unseen but steady. "I did it, Mom," she whispered. "I brought it all down. And I built something better." That evening, back in Manhattan, Julia returned to the rooftop garden of the Caroline Foundation. The sunset painted the skyline in streaks of gold and rose, and as the wind swept through the trees, she felt at peace, real and rooted. She wasn't the girl with the broken heart anymore. She wasn't the exiled heiress, the forgotten daughter, or the avenger in a silk dress. She was something more, a woman who had refused to stay erased. A small group of foundation members and friends gathered that night under string lights and soft music. There were no suits, no scripts, just warmth. Julia gave one final speech, not about the past, but the future. "Inheritance isn't just money," she said. "It's memory, it's responsibility, and sometimes it's the courage to say, 'I will not carry this forward.'" They toasted with cider and laughed under the stars, and as the evening faded, and the lights dimmed, Julia stood alone at the edge of the rooftop, looking down at the city her family once tried to own. She didn't feel like a conqueror. She felt free,